I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Arcane Mark, GM Quandaries, where you will ask Arcane Mark your questions, and we will answer any question in chat that we choose to answer, which will probably be most, if not all of them.
And we have a question already. GM Quandary. My party is tackling everything I throw at them without too much difficulty. Is it time to increase the challenges I build?
That is such a good question. It's one of the quintessential questions for GMs in almost any tabletop RPG that is based on challenging combats. So the answer to that question is going to be maybe. The first thing you need to do is talk to your players. Talk to them individually so that they don't feel like they're pressured by the other players, and ask them, are they satisfied with the combats? Be like, no, saying no is not a reflection on me. You don't have to say yes to make me feel good. Just be like, do you think that they're, even to take out the referendum on yourself, you can say,
do you think that they
you can give them an anonymous survey that they can just, even you won't know who said what, and you just put in, just saying like...
Harder than you prefer, easier than you prefer, just right.
Exactly. You can ask them that. Is like, it's much harder than I prefer, somewhat harder than I prefer, exactly right difficulty, a little too easy, much too easy. And you want to see, because sometimes, even though you are feeling that they're tackling everything you throw at them without too much difficulty, and as a GM, your vote matters, and if you're getting frustrated, then that does count for something, for sure. But you might be then project that everyone's unsatisfied with your GMing because it was too easy, when in fact, you may have a bunch of players who are kind of want a one-punch man style, just we win situation because they're having stress at home, and they want to be empowered by just completely curb stomping everything, and maybe that's great. Maybe one of your players actually thinks it was a little too hard for what they want because they want it to be even easier.
Or, another thing that comes into play too as a GM is that you see everything that the creature is capable of. And so you know what its limitations are. But players experiencing that creature for the first time don't know what its limitations are. And so they can build up a version of it in their minds that could have done something terrible if only for whatever. They may not know that the chance of a particular thing succeeding isn't that high, but they know that if that thing succeeded, it would have been really bad. Yeah, like, let's say that there's a creature with a breath that, like, is an acidic poison that eats away people's bodies. But really, it wasn't enough damage to threaten your party. They're min-maxers, as we've said in this question. But they see all these bodies eaten away by acid and poison, and they're like, this thing breathes on you and it eats away your entire body with acid and poison. They could be freaking out. And if they find some weird way to kill it before it can even go, they might be like, we're lucky we killed it before it even went. Who knows what would have happened if it got to use its breath weapon? And they might still feel tension that you did not, because you were like, okay, even if they critically failed their save, they were going to be fine from this. So it is important to realize that the level of tension they're feeling is not always the level of tension that you, with your GM kind of omniscience, are feeling. That being said, let's assume that they do say that they think it's a little bit too easy for them. So this doesn't mean let's go bump everything up across the board.
Yes. That's when you can start by keeping it within the same usual boundaries of the game, but skewing on the high side. So, for instance, in Pathfinder 2, where there's the encounters other than the trivial ones that don't provide any XP are usually low, moderate, severe, and extreme. And extreme is said, maybe don't even use it because it's a 50-50 chance, or use it for a final end boss. And maybe you used to use those encounters the way that the book told you to. But now you'll use low threat much less often, and use a lot of moderates, more severes, instead of just as like the big fight at the end. Maybe you use a Fall of Plaguestone level of severe encounters, and then maybe even the final bosses of each adventure or like dungeon are always extreme in yours.
I wouldn't recommend doing sort of like the +1 difficulty to all things adjustment at the same time, because that is a huge increase in cost on resources. But instead, try
try doing out both of those. Like, if you usually would do a long day with a lot of low encounters, and then try doing a long day with a lot of moderate encounters and see how that feels. Try throwing in, a severe when they don't have full resources or things like that. And then if that way you can more gradually step up, because you don't want to swing the pendulum too far over into TDK land. But
that's why if you treated them as just being one higher, that can be too much, because that means you'll never use low. They basically become trivial. You'll only use them as a set piece. Moderate is the lowest you'll throw as a regular encounter. And you'll use severe and extreme a lot of the time, and then maybe an extreme +1 for like a big epic fight. And that may be too much, whereas more so it could be just that you shift the amount of each encounter towards the harder end.
Another thing to consider is that just changing the difficulty of the encounter composition is not the only thing you can do. You can add other conditions that are less favorable to the PCs in terms of terrain, in terms of the tactics of the creatures,
in terms of other goals they need to
other goals that they need to
achieve in the fight.
adding in complex hazards or other things that are there. Sometimes a complex hazard replacing a creature can make the encounter much more difficult because you can't just handle it in exactly the same way.
Right, because the reason your group is stomping your encounters could be because they know more or less how to do a combat encounter against monsters. They filled a lot of bases. Even though you are varying your combat encounters, they have enough bases that when that is what they need to do, they can do it. But they might have a complete hole in their formation and their capabilities that having to put out a fire during the fight, or like rescue a hostage in the middle of the fight, or like Linda said, disable certain hazards, just like really messes them up, because it could be like, well, we do have someone who can disable this with these weird skills, but we've got someone who can do that, even though it can only be disabled with athletics. But that's actually the fighter. And usually the linchpin of our entire formation is the fighter doing cheesy crit tactics in the front line. So what are we going to do? Because we have to, if we want to complete this other goal, we have to pull the fighter out of that. And now what are we going to do when we have to adapt to being missing this important piece of our formation?
Another piece you can play around with is time pressure, whether that's, needing to complete an encounter a certain number of rounds, or having less time to rest, so you can't necessarily hit your 10 minutes in between encounters before you pop into something else.
That's right. So just...
Or perhaps there are other things that are around that make it harder to use certain tactics that your PCs would normally use. Like, there is an issue with dealing collateral damage that means you can't necessarily just throw a giant... Your party is used to throwing a giant fireball into the thing, but there's delicate documents or hostages or other things that are going on in that room that you can't just explode, or
Yeah, I mean, your group may have a SEAL Team 6 meta that can just stomp so many different encounters, but you can always adjust the encounter, make more complex encounters that force them to shake it up. And doing that and using slightly harder encounters that are still in the realm of possibility is a good way to test. Now, let's say, not only did you ask your group and they were like, yeah, it was too easy. You then did that, and guess what? They easily beat all of those encounters too. Then you're in a situation where, and then you ask them, hey, I just adjusted my encounters. As you can see, I've put in extra side goals. Obviously, we're not going to do that every time. I'm starting to use higher encounters. What do you think of the difficulty now? And they're like, yeah, man, still too easy. That's when you start just being like, okay, whatever, we're going to do it, and we're going to make it harder. That's what you want. But make sure you check in with them after you do that for a little while to make sure the pendulum didn't swing too far the other way. They might find out that they got a monkey's paw wish when they wished for it to be too harder, because they might be like, look, I even was telling you that it was too easy when you asked me, so I can't be mad about it, but it's getting really stressful now, and I actually liked it better when it was too easy.
Yeah. And one thing that you can do to mix that up, because it can be a lot of pressure to have those really tough encounters, particularly if they take a long time to run, is focus on making if you're going to make one thing harder, make it like those boss fights. Make it those set pieces. Make it those awesome ones. And then, it's not as much of a big deal if some of the in-between encounters are easier. As it is if people feel like they just, kicked the boss to the curb.
That's right.
And sent them flying off into the sky Team Rocket style.
So we have pulled up 3 new Quandaries. Let's go to Quandary number 2. Quandary 2 is, as a GM, how can you balance the the possibility of creating encounters and situations to try to be fun for the party, where you set their characters up to do the thing that they specifically can do or seed treasure that they're interested in, versus building for verisimilitude of the world, where it's skewed towards what would actually make most sense in the world.
All right, well, I'm going to start with session 0 because I think this is where we start here.
Yes, so absolutely.
Because you know, it can be challenging if you have a character who's like, you know, I'm going to play the gunslinger. No one else around here even knows about the concept of guns. Then, you know, you're going to have a conversation of something so far on that end of like, yeah, you know, you're not going to like find them in loot drops, but we can find a way for you to craft them. But unless like, and then make sure you have an understanding with that player that, yeah, you know, we're going to have a way to work around that particular thing. I would say that, but if you can make good connections with the characters from the beginning into the story, that will help you set up quite a bit with allowing you to put things in that fit with their characters.
So step 0 or step 1, whatever you want, is that session 0.
Step 2, I would say, is the things that players are interested in are going to change dynamically over time across the course of the campaign. So it's easier to make tie-ins to things that the players became interested in throughout the course of the adventure because they thought something that you presented was cool, because that's something that you have defined as existing in your campaign world. So if they're like, hey, you know, this group of rangers is really awesome, I want to learn more about them. It's like, well, the group of rangers exists in your setting, so you can easily.
So there is a flip side of step 2, which is basically the exact same thing, but applied in the opposite direction, which is essentially when you're running a game, you're probably either running a very narrative-heavy game that is just like, this is this plot, and you're following this plot, or it's a little more sandboxy, and they can go around pursuing things, like Linda said. If they're interested in those particular organization, they can look into it. If they're on a narrative train and there's no way off the train, part of the social contract of them staying on the narrative train is that you're going to put some stuff that they want on the train.
Yes.
Because that's just how that works. So I'm going to be assuming when you're talking about world building and verisimilitude, that is for not that situation. That is for a more sandboxy, you can go where you're going to go. Just like Linda said, they could get tied into something that you explained in the plot. Similarly, look, you can have a world where nunchucks represent 1 in 100,000 weapons that are found in this area. Because nobody thinks they're a practicable weapon. Even though you're in a place that some people do use nunchucks, but they make 99,999 swords, axes, spears, and other things for every 1 nunchuck. But if your person who is in your group is a nunchuck user, and we're not talking narrative, we're trying to do verisimilitude. It's not even that weird if you're like, okay, they're like, I go to the tavern to listen for some rumors, and I'm gonna talk to mercenaries because I want to hear about like cool weapons and armor. And you can be like, yeah, you hear like, you stay there, you hear dozens and hundreds of stories about weapons and armor. The one that sticks out to you is about a magic nunchuck, was the only time that anybody has talked about that in years of doing this or something like that. Because if just like Linda said, if the character or the player gets interested in something you presented, you can tie that in. Similarly, if the character is interested in it and they're trying to find information about it, then they will find information about the one that's there. Like, nobody has to search your giant metropolis to find a sword. You can just say they found it. But if they search, they probably will find a nunchuck, even though that's not very common in the world.
So I think that one of the questions here, and the time that I find this a little more challenging to deal with, is when it comes very much in from the metagame of like, player A thinks that the spell I Win is a very powerful spell and wants to find I Win. Their character, but I Win is a rare spell, and so their character really shouldn't know that I Win exists. And then player is like, I want I Win.
Yes.
So I would say that in that case, you know, you kind of have to have a conversation about expectations. So it's like, you know, I guess I called it I Win, but maybe I shouldn't call it that because we're assuming here that you've decided that you're allowing the spell, so it's probably not
so
automatic.
it's not blood money. So
okay, yeah. So it's not I Win, but it's like this is a spell.
Fireball plus.
Yes, or like this is a spell that's usually associated with something in entirely a different part of the world and things like that, and that character wouldn't necessarily have heard of it. I would say that, you know, if you want to include that in your game, then introducing an opportunity for that character to hear about it so that you don't have that kind of like jarring contrast between the two.
Yes. So, and if you're on a railroad train, that train should just include what the players want, because they can't get off, so it should go to places they like. Similarly, when you're doing a one-shot, everybody expects Chekhov's guns to be fired, and honestly, if you don't, because you're like, yeah, it's more verisimilitude if you all have all these abilities for very specific stuff, and then they never come up in the one-shot, it's like, no, come on.
There's no point.
People want to see the Chekhov's gun fired in the one-shot. So, it very much depends on your game. Let's go into the next quandary. The next quandary comes from Copernicus. How do you improve running NPCs, especially in an adventure path? I find it hard to remember everything the NPCs should know, while also having an interesting personality.
So, I like to, when there's a lot of NPCs going on and things get tangled up in my head, I like to start by taking some notes. So that I remember, like, okay, you know, what's this NPC's name, and some key facts about them, like, you know, what are their relationships to other NPCs that are presented, and what are some of their major goals and affiliations.
Try to remember their long-term goals, if you know what they are. I'm probably a medium-term goal, and also short-term. AKA, what is their motivation for being in this scene that they're in right now?
What do they want to do in this scene?
And if the answer is that they don't have any reason to be in this scene, maybe they don't need to be in the scene, and you can simplify it by removing them from the scene. Because you may come up with this idea in your head for a scene, and then you later realize, wait a minute, though, Lord Evilton, like, literally is doing nothing here but, like, yelling at people and being evil. Actually, maybe that's enough. Maybe it provides a little flavor that the evil lord just says no to everything and yells at everyone, and then that is a reason to keep Lord
so his reason to be there, then his reason to be there is as a foil,
But maybe
or, like, this is the PC's chat. Well, I guess, like, but you wouldn't want to throw him, like, in the PCs you're staying with. So there's two different why are they here. There's the why are they here for the purposes of your story, and why as a person did they choose to be here, and what are they trying to do?
What are they trying to do there, and also what are you, the GM, trying to do with them? Which may not be the same thing, and it's important to know when you have a goal that differs from your NPCs, because you may find that role-playing them accurately causes them to veer off of what you were trying to get them to do in the first place in a way that's not great for your ultimate desires as the GM.
In terms of what they should know, I think that, you know, there's a certain baseline of common knowledge in the world that, like, it doesn't really matter quite so much exactly how much you decide that folks know, but in terms of things that are important to remember, like, does that NPC know key secrets that would be of interest to the PCs? And does that NPC have inaccurate perceptions?
That's right. So, in terms of having to think about what the NPC should know, I think that you want to think in advance if there are any major secrets that or questions that you know the PCs are going to ask, because they always ask everybody this, because they're like, who killed Mr. Body? And they ask everyone they meet, do you know who killed Mr. Body? It's a major campaign question. You're like, no, I have no clues for that. So think about the answers to questions and sort of pieces of information that are secrets that you think that the PCs are going to ask about, or that the NPC is going to volunteer most likely. Yeah. Other than that, you may have to figure out on the fly if they ask for something unexpected based on the NPC's faction, based on the NPC's power base, based on
and
the
NPC's
skills and education, and, like, social position, what kind of thing they might know. And maybe you don't know, so you just roll it. You roll a recall knowledge check if you're playing Pathfinder 2 for the appropriate skill based on their skill modifier, and be like, let the dice fall as they may. I told the PCs this was a DC 30. This NPC has a plus 20. It's a little better than 50-50.
And an NPC knowing things doesn't necessarily mean that they blurt all of them out to the PCs immediately upon seeing them. So you have some flexibility for, you know, the things that they haven't directly spoken to the PCs about. As long as maybe they know that thing, maybe they don't. As long as their behavior isn't completely nonsensical.
Also,
the other way around. Like, if it's like, they didn't know there was going to be an attack.
In the real world, people sometimes take actions that are nonsensical based on something they should have known, but weren't thinking about at the time until you remind them, wait a minute, what about this thing? And they're like, oh, crap.
Yep.
That's right. So if it's like, why is this sage not preparing for tomorrow? Tomorrow is a major planar conjunction where a bunch of demons are going to come out. The sage should know that. Does that mean he's summoning the demons?
It's like, no, the sage got distracted.
Maybe he just got distracted. He wasn't thinking about that conjunction. But if you mentioned, hey, isn't there a planar conjunction tomorrow that we should be, like, warding the area? He'd be like,
yeah.
I really should have done that.
NPCs don't have to have perfect memory, because nobody does.
Yep. This is not one of those, like, weird psychological tension mystery shows where, like, people stare off at each other and say, well, you would have had to know this thing, or else you wouldn't have done that, which therefore proves that this person was innocent. And like, no, sometimes people just
what I was
forget
thinking
something.
about when I was talking about, like, the attack or whatever, I feel like generally, like, the kinds of things where it's like there is an imminent danger of something terrible happening that you would wish to prevent, generally people will at least remember that. But other than that, you know, maybe they just decided not to mention it, especially if they don't trust the PCs that much.
That's right. And who's going to trust this wandering band of adventurers?
I guess one thing to consider, too, is, in terms of information, is when an NPC may be misinformed, or when an NPC has lied to the PCs. That's another one that's good to make a note of.
You want to remember so they can keep their lies straight. Or so that you give the right misinformation. Let's say maybe you rolled and you got a critical failure, and you gave them a critical failure on a certain piece of information. But now that means the NPC really actually believes that. Yeah. So that could be important for role-playing them later on, unless the PCs are able to correct that misconception. So let's see. The next question is, GM Quandary from Lava Being. My party hasn't been tracking X, loot, NPCs, etc., and doesn't seem interested in doing so. However, they seem to want the information to be tracked. Do I track it for them, try to be more flexible, or keep encouraging them to track it? So that is definitely an interesting question. It will depend on your group, your overall social contract, and what your players are comfortable with. Like, the question is, why do they seem to want the information tracked? Is it because they want it to be available? Will it be enough that you just make a note that they met a certain NPC, and then you promise to tell them later, this is NPC X. You met her back at the ball where you promised that you would do her a favor later because she let you into a side area.
And for example, for loot, are they cool with you having like a shared spreadsheet where you just dump the name of all the treasure that they found, and then it's up to them to decide how they're going to distribute and use it?
Yeah, like, is it okay if the way that it's tracked is just that you know from your side? Or do they want something usable by them that they are working on themselves? Because if they want something that they can use and work on, then they need to use and work on it to have that work.
Yeah. Because I would find, like, you know, we've had, for example, like, you know, one of our GMs would often have, we have a treasure spreadsheet. And so there's a front tab of the treasure spreadsheet, and the GM will dump a list of the treasure we found in the beginning. And then, you know, I'm usually the one who's more of the lead player on, like, organizing things. I'll talk through with people and be like, okay, you know, who wants this item? This person has, I have marked down that this person already has a +1, but not a resilient.
Right. And then the GM puts facts that we learned about NPCs on the wiki.
Yeah. And then, like, GM puts facts we know about NPCs, and then, or puts facts, and then sometimes, like, I'll write notes, and then the GM will add in things or whatever.
We all can do it if we want.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say that, like, you know, the main trouble there is if you are feeling frustrated because they are asking you to do something that is, like, more than what you want to do, and you feel like they need to be pulling their weight more.
And you need to be honest with them.
If you are feeling frustrated because you feel like you're constantly needing to remind them of things that you already told them.
And let's say that you're okay with reminding them. Let's try to put the extreme version of this question that is very specifically only the information that was provided in the question, which is this. The group refuses to track it. Also, when you try to be like, okay, I'll just tell you when you meet someone that you've met them before and what context, and they're like, no, that's not enough. I need to have a reference sheet that I can go to on my own time, including outside of sessions, to look at, to see all this information. I am not going to participate in any way towards updating it, keeping it up to speed or doing anything on it, but it needs to exist for me. That is a situation where it's just like, well, you know what? Then you need to help out.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you so entitled that it needs to exist for your convenience, but then you refuse to do any help with it? And maybe the answer is that they actually have a really good reason, and they're like, well, thanks for saying why you're so entitled. I'll tell you the reason why is that I have to work 4 extra gigs in addition to my job to pay for like these other sorts of things that are going on in my life, and that's something I wanted to have to talk about, dude, but I really just need to have this so that I can check it in between sessions.
But you probably have, that sort of thing doesn't need to be evenly distributed among players. The players who have more time and capacity and interest, there should be at least somebody at your table.
The problem is that the one who really needs it to be a resource might not be the one who theoretically has capacity.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily matter. If your table...
Yeah, well, that's part of discussing it with everyone.
Yeah, like if it's something that your table needs, then seeing who can pitch in and do that.
Like, you may have, like, a Gree-Eye situation where they were passing around one eye between the 3 of them, where you have 3 players. One of them needs there to be this resource, but they are too full of work hours and cannot do it. One of them would be great at making this resource, but also is super busy for their job makes them do similar things all the time. They can't do it. The third one has plenty of time, doesn't need the resource because they are super sloppy and disorganized and they couldn't put together one that anyone could use. And it would be like, I don't know what you would do in that case, especially if you also don't have enough time to do it yourself. So
I think you'd probably move your frequency of running to less frequent, and then you say, okay, well, if part of what the table needs for a successful session is to have...
What if only one of them needed it, though?
Well, if you have 3 players and one of them is totally checked out without a resource, then that's actually a serious critical issue. And if you're so taxed that you can't, like, spend an extra 30 minutes of session prep time to, like, throw in some basic info, then you're probably really stuck on time yourself, and you'd be better off reducing your session frequency for that reason.
You can reduce your sessions and make sure you're ready.
Or make them shorter.
Yep, that can
and
be
make part of your session time be putting that kind of resource together.
Yeah, with the person who would be very skilled at doing it. Be like, well, we used to do 4-hour sessions. We're now going to do 3-hour sessions. And then Jane, who is an expert database coder, for that 4th hour, Jane and I will put this together so that that Vorthos can have his like compendium of all information. So there's ways to work it out together. You're a group, and you'll be able to solve this issue.
Yeah, and I would say that, like, you probably wouldn't want to say, like, well, Vorthos is the one who's forcing us to go to shorter sessions, but instead being, like...
Vorthos!
Those kinds of resources can be helpful for the whole group.
Yep.
So you can have them for everybody.
They'll be helpful for the whole group, except for Sloppy Joe, who just... couldn't keep track of it and would never use it, who's the person who had all the time.
But you as a GM, like, having that... Well, I mean, how much time are you going to waste if, like, the PCs don't figure out what treasure they have and don't know what they sold, or, like, whether or not an item is on someone, and then it's like, oh, wait, is this +1 resilient chain shirt the same +1 resilient chain shirt? Or were there 2 +1 resilient chain shirts that dropped recently? What about the one that we bought, etc., etc.?
And you'd be like, I thought we gave that to Sloppy Joe. And Sloppy Joe's like, I don't know. I just have my AC on my sheet. It's not broken down in any way. Maybe I do have that +1 resilient chain shirt. Maybe I don't.
Well, there are players...
Like, Sloppy Joe, what are your saves? Oh, plus 13. Okay, well, if it's plus 13, then that means you do have the +1 resilient.
There are players who are roughly at that Sloppy Joe level of documentation in my group, which is why, when I maintain the party treasury, I also have a bracket after each item that says what character they were assigned to. So that way, if they have something on their character sheet, then it's like, oh, is this +1 resilient chain shirt? Where did I get it from? It's like, this is the party treasury. It says you have it.
I have to admit, I have been the person to reverse engineer their saving throws to determine they had the resilient before in our group, where it's like, you definitely have it because your saving throws are 1 higher than they would be otherwise.
Correct.
Unless you accidentally leveled up early, in which case your other stats would also be 1 higher. So, yeah. All right, let's look at our next GM Quandary. Also, keep putting in GM Quandaries into the chat if you have more, because this is we're currently going up to the most recent one that has been put in here. Sundance Kid asks, if I'm advertising for a game on a Discord server, besides listing the time, date, frequency, What else should I write? I'm new and want to make sure I get a good group of people.
Game system?
So, yes, game system. Now, it may be a Discord server that's a server for a particular system, so you may not need to do that. But I would say that this is where you're looking at session -1, because when you're advertising for a Discord server, your advertisement and the people's responses to you and your communications back and forth are part of your session -1. They come before your session 0 when you're still deciding on your group.
So what's your top line pitch for the story?
Exactly.
And,
give your best top line pitch. Don't just give the time and frequency, but like give them what it's about. Because here's the thing. If you just give the time and frequency and like it's in Pathfinder and just something vague, and you'll get everybody who wants to play Pathfinder in that time, which could be a lot of people to sift through. And then you later tell them, oh, by the way, it's in the Iruxi Empire of Droon, and you can only play in Iruxi, and we're banning these 5 classes that aren't really in Droon, and it's also heavily focused on the pervasive magic rules because you're going into a weird magic zone. And, like, suddenly they'd be like, no, man, I was expecting I was going to play my Dompier Drow, who was exiled from Drow due to being good. But wait, we're not doing Drow anymore in the remaster. No, but I am. And he's exiled from society for being a Dompier because of being part vampire and is very emo in 2 different ways. And then you'd be like, oh, we're in Droon. Yep. We're not going to do that. And then you have some issues. Whereas if you say, I'm recruiting for my Droon campaign, Lizards Unite, and then you may get fewer people, but everyone who applies, except for maybe people who are so hungry for a game that they'll just apply to anything right now because they're looking for it, which you don't get as much unless you're doing 5e, where the number of player to GM ratio is absurd. You'll get the people who are like, I've wanted to play Lizards in Droon ever since I read that they ride on dinosaurs, and this is my chance. And so you'll get the people who innately buy into you if you actually pitch and actually make your pitch more specific. And now you may think, is this a problem? Is this going to mean that if I make it too specific, am I going to get nobody? And the answer is that you may actually get more people than you think. Because if you're just, especially if there's a lot of games that are offered on your server, since it's not 5e where there's such a drought of games, if there's a lot of games offered and you're just another one of the generic ones, that's
generic fantasy, Pathfinder, be a hero.
Everyone can apply, and the people who couldn't get into the other games for whatever reason, which you don't know what it is, but who do apply to every game just hoping to find one, will still apply to it. Plus, some people will just see it and like it and apply at random. But if you do the Droon Lizard one, some people who might just not have applied to it, other random one, but are like, this is my chance for Droon Lizard, I love Droon Lizard stuff, who wouldn't have applied otherwise will do it. It's the same principle behind, like, I remember when talking about, like, writing, like, textbooks and other technical papers, if you narrow the scope of them, they sometimes cause more people in the field to read them, because you've removed 80% of who could possibly read it, but the remaining 20% is like, this is exactly for me. There's no way that this could be targeted more for me, and then they pick it up at a much higher degree.
Yeah. Another thing that was sort of implied here that needs to be clear from the beginning is the parameters for building a character, or if characters are provided, so that people don't like run off and start doing something and they're like, wait, no, that doesn't work.
That's right.
If you're like, build a first level character who's an Iruxi from Droon, and like, give them some way to check in on what you're talking about. Proper noun wise is useful too. So it might be like, Droon, a settlement, and so you can have like some information, or you can like link them to a Pathfinder wiki page that has a little bit more. But having a pitch that doesn't have proper nouns in it first, like, particularly if you're talking to folks who are not like,
we're gonna be
setting
playing
masters.
Dino Riders of the Lizard Empire.
Yeah.
For example.
Exactly.
Also, you may want to tell them what resources they're allowed to use. For instance, I recommend letting them use Battle Zoo Ancestry's dragons to make a dragon character. I'm just saying. I know the guy who wrote it. But
I do too.
If you do, and you advertise that, you're going to find people who wanted to play a dragon, but other people would not let them play dragons, are going to be really excited about applying. Be like,
especially if you especially want dragons, because you're like, I'm doing lizards and dinosaurs and dragons, it's scaly all the way down.
Yes.
And if you tell them in advance, then you'll get people who want to do that. Whereas if you tell them later and you're like, I kind of want there to be at least one dragon, and then they all might be like, oh, it's a pain to check out another book that we haven't already read yet, though. I don't really know if I want to do that. Because you've picked out players, not kind of a priori getting players who were excited about the resources that you were planning on using. So this is just another situation of the same reason that Session 0 has become so popular compared to just going cold into the campaign on Session 1. This sort of Session -1, when you're setting up the campaign, can allow you to start out by funneling players who are going to be like all in with what you want.
One other thing to talk about is the method you're planning to use for communication with them. You know, are you planning to run it on Discord? Is it going to be, or are you going to have a VTT, things like that? So folks know, like, oh, are they going to need to pick up a software thing, or is it going to be compatible with what they already have and such?
That's right. Now, if you're running Pathfinder, there's a Pathfinder baseline. So you can say in your post, if your game is not on the Pathfinder baseline because it's either stricter or looser in certain areas, you probably want to let people know in advance so they don't find out in a surprise. Especially if you're not willing to be flexible. Because if you're willing to be flexible and be like, oh, well, I was thinking of including this, but if anybody has a problem, we won't, then that's fine to wait for later. But if you're like, no, this only works with themes of this one thing that's not in the Pathfinder baseline, or this only works if we're even stricter than the Pathfinder baseline in this one way.
Or you're like, I'm super afraid of spiders, so like no Anati and there won't, or spider companions or other things like that.
Yes. So you want to put those things in the pitch so that you don't get farther, and then you find out that the player doesn't work with that, where you're like, yeah, we're going to do it bloodless, even stricter than the Pathfinder baseline. Or you're like, yeah, no, we're going to include some of these themes that aren't in the Pathfinder baseline. So any time that you are like kind of changing some of the core assumptions, you could just put that into your pitch. Obviously, you don't want to make it so long that nobody will be able to read it, so try to find a way to be concise, like without and avoiding proper nouns, like Linda said. So, like, for example, we want to be playing Dino Riders of the Lizard Empire.
Dino Riders of the Lizard Empire, an adventure for level 1 character. Adventure starts at level 1, you know, letting them know where to start, build, and then that you want them to build a character.
Yes. So that would
it's like we're using the Pathfinder baseline for the level of content, you know.
That's right.
And like a little note to where to find that, and you can play with anything. You can pick any common option.
Yep.
You can want like, plus these ancestries.
Be like, we're using the Pathfinder baseline just as an FYI. You know, Iruxi do like eat the bodies of intelligent creatures if they are dead. They're not necessarily going out just to kill you, to eat you. But if that's a thing for you, you may put something like that in there, like trigger warning, lizard folk eat people. Or if you're flexible on that because it's not a major plot point that they eat people, you could just not put that and then deal with it later if people have some problems there. So that's basically what I would suggest, because basically this is your chance to sort of like win the initiative and get a leg up on what you're doing next.
So there's one thing to consider with pitches, is that if you have a story that from the beginning it's not clear what the major point of the story is going to be, it's okay to spoil what the major point of the story is going to be. In fact, it's better.
Especially if the major point of the story is going to be revealed soon anyway.
Yeah, because you don't want to be in a situation where, like, you only tell people about what happens in the first session when they have come to the village for a peaceful festival, and then suddenly the village is attacked, and then, like, it's a gritty survival game or whatever, and, like, they want them to be ready for what the adventure actually is.
Or, like, let's say there's attacks by bandits on the town, which is being defended by the town guards, who the bank of the civilization god Abadar is funding the guards, and the PCs are helping against the bandits. But you know that later on in the campaign it's revealed that the Abadar is corrupt, people are corrupt. They created the bandits in order to try to take control of the government, and they are the main villain. and then you talk only about the thing that is known, and then one of the players is like, yeah, we're gonna. They all decide to make extremely pro Abadar, like paladins type champions of Abadar, clerics of Abadar, who are like in the local church of Abadar, and it's like,
So in that case, you might be like, you know, you can put things down with parameters for like the kind of PCs. It's like, you know, PCs are folks who have like who are part of the town, but characters cannot be part of the town guard or the Church of Abadar.
Yep. It'd be like, this is an adventure about allying with them.
Yeah.
And your alliance will be an important part of the adventure. But therefore, if you were already in that group, then it won't be as interesting. So I'm going to say you can't be in it.
Yeah.
And that way you won't spoil that actually they become the villains, but
you've still given enough information that you're not going to have to back yourself into a corner where you have to improvise.
Yes. Now some of that may not need to be in the initial pitch because of the fact that some of that may be something that you can send after you've selected your players. You're going to have to decide and make sure it's not too long because then people will skip over it. But these are all things to think about, especially because you may need to correspond with people back and forth.
In fact, it's generally good to recommend that people don't, like, charge straight forward into the 50-page backstory before having a chat with the group as a whole in a session 0 about what kinds of things are going to work well.
Correct. But you want to, when you're, like, soliciting publicly for players, you want people who are excited, and they may be excited about something that actually wouldn't work. And so there's ways to temper expectations. It's tough. It's a tricky balancing act. And you know what? You're doing it your first time. You might not do it perfect the first time, but you'll learn. Everything with GMing, you have to learn to become better at it in general. And, like, pretty much everyone I know, except maybe Linda somehow, I don't know how you did it in Council of Thieves the first time, has, like, had some pretty major stumbles in their first time of doing anything that was like big and new for their group.
You forget how much you saved my butt in the beginning with the adventure.
I did save your butt, but you also just somehow like made that thing that was considered in the review of the adventure to be a low point for the adventure and the adventure path to be terrifying, and you terrified everyone.
I mean, yeah, it was a successful session. It's just that some of the characters weren't biting the hook after that because of the difference between what was told to players in advance and what the adventure actually expected.
That was the adventure path's fault.
Well, that's why I mentioned this here.
Yes.
Because it's an example of a time when Paizo didn't get it right. And it caused problems as a GM. Anyway.
That's true.
There was a question above that has scrolled
There's
off now.
one more question above.
Yeah, it was about when your players don't have as much time.
Yes, when your players don't have enough time. Let's see where it is here. Lava Being says, the party and I have less and less time for play sessions. What can I do as GM to ensure our shorter or less frequent sessions are still fun and productive?
All right, step 1. How much of the bookkeeping has to actually be at the table versus can happen between sessions?
So let's assume, first of all, that you make sure that you do things that can be obviously done offline. There's still something that you need to think about when you're thinking about your sessions. You may not be a director. You may not think of yourself as like an auteur who's making a independent film or something like every time. But every session is a little bit like a movie or a TV show or a play in not just the plot that happens when the session is active, but in the fact that there's rising action, there's falling action. You need to build up momentum to get started. You can't just necessarily have a cold open that will let you start the session. And there's always a price to be paid in having more shorter sessions over fewer longer sessions in that ramp up and ramp down time. But there are ways to try to make it more efficient so that you don't have to spend as much of your table's time in the ramp up.
I want to talk about one of the things that that one of our GMs does for having short sessions that's pretty effective. It's recognizing sometimes that it's better just to narrate some of those low threat encounters than to run them. If we have a session and we only have time to like run one encounter and it's like, well, we've done some easy encounters recently, we don't necessarily need to do an easy one now. Let's talk about how we went against this one and then focus on this part that's going to be more engaging.
That's right. So learn to narrate past things, not just encounters.
Mm-hmm.
There are whole swaths of things that you could either play out all the way or you can narrate. I mean, I played a game once where the GM spent like an hour and a half with the cleric player buying wine at the wine store, and one of the other players was about to throw something. You don't need to go into that much detail. You can also pass over it and just sort of be like, you went to the wine store and you talked to him for an hour and a half about different kinds of wines, and you found the very best one.
Mm-hmm. You've learned that the owner of the wine store, she's just as much into wine as you are, you know, and she invited you to come to a
wine
party,
tasting.
to a wine tasting next week.
Yep. So you can do that with narration without zooming in. It's something I talked about on a Roll for Combat live stream when we were talking about 4E skill challenges and why they jarred for people, is that they often turned a skill check into a scene, whereas in other games the skill check was a beat and within a scene. But your friend, when you have shorter sessions, is to zoom out to a scene and just narrate across the scene while doing fewer things instead of doing those scenes beat by beat.
Yeah, because
that'll
it
save
takes
you time.
doing the beat by beat takes a lot more time, not just because you're going into more detail, but also because when people are speaking directly in character voice, they have to think about what the character is going to say. So they're naturally going to speak more slowly than when they describe overall, you know, that my character is going to present the benefit that her connections through the Merchants Guild could have to this alliance, and show and surreptitiously show the symbol that proves that she has a connection with the notorious underworld figure, you know, but this notorious underworld figure or whatever.
Right.
And like then the player doesn't have to sit there and think like, how exactly am I going to set up this entire scene? You can have people describe what they want to do, and then like have some checks to determine how well that goes.
Think about how TV shows cut to get to the next scene. Like in earlier TV shows, they would often show you like the car driving up to the place as the person was arriving there, so that you saw that they arrived. But nowadays, they can pack more content and scenes in because they'll just cut. Maybe they'll show you a different plot element, and when they cut back, the characters you were following are now already at the place that they were going to.
Maybe you see them opening the front door, and then boom, they're in.
Right. So how can you cut back and forth so that you reduce any sort of scenes and beats that weren't providing important content? How the other important thing is, those are how you can go faster in the session. But I was starting to say before we went into that there are ways that you can cut down on the amount of build up and cooldown time that are at the beginning and the end, which are the bane of a short session. Unless you're kind of cool with that and are like, we don't see each other a lot, let's just have lots of time at the beginning. One of them is you can potentially have a different time that's a social hour. Now, if your people are busy, they probably won't be able to go to that either. Another one is that you can have an optional earlier starting point. Like, be like, hey, look, the session is going to start at 7, but at 6:30, some of us will come on and we can just chat about things for the week. But when it gets to 7, we're going to do a transition and move over to the session. And that's whether you're here at 6:30, 7, or even after 7.
Yeah.
Now, asterisk, if you have people who are perennially late, you may need to play the game where you tell them that the session is starting at 6:30 and that the talking part starts at 6 when you actually want to start at 7.
Another thing you can do with that potentially is if you want to, let's say that you have players who are not good at leveling up between sessions, or like people are going to want to have a discussion about things potentially before the session, then you can have that be that time. It's like, I'll be online at 6 and I'll be available if folks want to talk about stuff with their level up and their characters and things like that. Otherwise, we're going to start at 7. And then if someone's like, well, I didn't level up yet, it's like, well, add +1 to your things, and as we go along throughout the session, decide what
with the rise of online tools, if you have a Foundry campaign and the players' characters are loaded in there, you could probably see that they haven't leveled up yet and ping the people who didn't level up to make sure that they have, which is a good thing. Otherwise, you might be just keep asking, did you level up yet? Did you level up yet? So another thing that you want to do is, like, obviously you can add that extra lead time at the beginning to be like, we're chatting for 30 minutes, but we're starting the session at 7. I know some of you can't make 6:30, and that's okay. Make sure that you have a tool that you use for the transition to make sure that it is an effective transition to help people's headspace move from the we're BSing before the session mode into the we're playing the session mode.
Mm-hmm.
The more that you can use the effect of repetition to do that, the better. So, like, let's say you have a theme track of a music that you play that's like the opening music of your campaign, not because you think you're like, I am pompous and my campaign deserves its own theme song, but more of a just like, people will learn after a few times that once they hear that music,
that's
you put
the
it
time
on,
to start, yeah.
just like the lights dimming in a movie theater, and then they learn, hey, we can stop BSing, and now it's time to start.
Or another one that you could do is the last we left our heroes.
That can be after the music.
Yeah.
You can be like, all right, everyone. When last we left our band of heroes, you were traveling through the crystal caverns where a sobbing vampire attacked you with radiant light beams that bounced off of the crystals, and you managed to defeat it, and it dissolved into a puddle of acid, leaving behind a strange ruby that you haven't been able to examine yet. This not only will allow you to summarize, but you can give a leading summary like I just did that will help you also push people to immediately take action. If you can't think of something like that actually happened last time, you can either, because we're talking at the beginning now, the end of a session, you can try to end on a question like that mysterious ruby or a cliffhanger, or if you forgot to do that, you can just add one anyway. Like, let's say the party was actually ended the session like having a kind of in circles discussion for 30 minutes where they were at the table debating what to do next because they had to deal with the evil thieves guild that was also trying to get the ruby from the sobbing vampire.
So you could be like, oh yeah, you were around the table and you were debating for a while about what to do, and suddenly you heard a frantic knock at the door.
Yes, or you hear it's be like, okay, you play the music and be like, you hear the sound of glass shattering as Thieves Guild elite break into the windows, and we know you have the ruby, one of them shouts. Suddenly there's a scene. So you could either do that at the end of a session on purpose to like create a cliffhanger, getting people waiting, and they'd be like, can't wait to see what happens next, which also helps you have less lead-in time at the beginning of the next one because they're impatient to find out. Or if you forgot to do that but want to do it anyway, you can just start the new session with a new action scene or something like that. If you start with action instead of discussion, it will help, because if you start with good momentum like that, you can often keep it. Whereas if you start with discussion, you could get bogged in discussion the entire short session.
Especially if it's one of those dreaded, like, people have different ideas about what should be done next situations.
Yep. Absolutely. And that could be something that can definitely just stall out your entire session.
So, when you can, having folks make a decision before you conclude the last session is useful.
Yeah,
or like,
sure.
Jumping in with that kind of like, well, it took a while and so the Thieves Guild attacks. But if it's a decision and it's
everything
like,
changed when the Thieves Guild attacked.
Like, are you going to enter through the secret door or through the other thing? Another way you can start it is if they were like stuck on a decision that previous time, being like, okay, so, the party was generally debating between doing a frontal assault on the fortress and sneaking in. Some advantages that were presented for the frontal assault were A, B, and C. Some advantages were presented for the stealth approach were C, D, and E.
Yep. You can be like, of course, you're welcome to try a third approach. I'm not telling you those are the only two. These are the ones that you two were...
summary of the discussion last time
discussed about last time.
Was that.
David Nielsen wonders, did they ever say what invisible stalkers call themselves? In the plane of air, invisible stalkers are just called stalkers. They're like, well, we know we're invisible, but we're stalkers.
But I found that kind of framing can help with when there's intractable discussions.
Yep. try to break it down. I try to do that in the middle of a session. Even if
Yeah.
I'm a player, I try to summarize and break it down, and then see if we can have a vote or something.
Yeah, I'm
like
assuming
that.
like the fact that they're still discussing means that probably didn't. And calling a vote is an excellent strategy for getting yourself
Yes.
out of a bind like that.
That's typically a good solution. Of course, if they're split 50-50, then you're in big trouble.
Then you're probably going to have to call in some sort of other situation.
Suddenly, the Thieves Guild attacks.
Mm-hmm. Or sometimes you can have an NPC that tips the balance in some sort of, or a situation that tips the balance in some sort of a way. Like, maybe they're like, well, we want to do a frontal assault, or not, no, we want to do this, and then you can suggest that, like, they take some, maybe they'd want to, like, do another scout around the place to get some more information about how those two strategies might work.
It's
and
like,
then you can
frontal
provide
assault,
information.
no sneak in. Frontal assault, no sneak in. Let's talk to our patron. Patron's like, well, I have 10 architects in my pocket, and I have the blueprint before they built this building, including sewers that are attached to it that nobody remembers because they're part of the Undercity. Then maybe that'll change if you had 3 versus 3, maybe one of the 3 frontal assault people like, oh, I like this sewer Undercity plan, and then they move over and it's 4v2 now.
Yeah.
So
I find that, like, instead of you wouldn't want to have an NPC be like, I'm telling you, you must plan A.
Yeah, in this case it would be giving them more information.
But in this case, giving them information, it's like, well, you know, so be like, and also I know that the guards at the front are something.
The guards at the front are all Balors, except for one of them who's a pit fiend infiltrating the Balors. But we're level 3. Yes, but that is what the guards at the front are.
Why are you assaulting this
However, the people in the place don't trust them and have anti-fiend wards. So if you go in through the secret basement that you sneak in, the fiends can't even get into the building.
Also, all the enemies and traps in the secret
level
basement
1
are
and
level
2.
1 and 2.
They only have these Balors because they kind of found this building that was guarded by Balors that their ancestors created, and they decided this was a good place to have a lair.
Like, so ultimately, like, obviously this is a practical example, but if you have something where, like, idea number 1 that the players are pitching is, like, due to some fact that you are aware of and the way you set things up is, like, a terrible idea, and idea number 2 would work well, then finding some way to get the relevant information so that they know that to the players, and
For
then
instance,
they don't
if
waste
it's
time
like,
debating.
we need to get this thing in the royal castle. One group is like, let's assault the royal castle. It's like, and the others, let's sneak in. It's like, yeah, guys, first of all, maybe, like, you could also consider diplomacy, but you should think about what it means to assault the royal castle, because that's where the Royal Guard are, and you know that the head of the Royal Guard
is level 15, and you're level 3.
Is a level 15, and you're level 3. And the Royal Guard consists of 1,000 people. And not only that, all of the captains of the Royal Guard are around level 8 to 12. And there's 12 contingents of the Royal Guard. And their lieutenants are level 5 to 8, and each of the 12 contingents have 5 lieutenants.
This is a serious Royal Guard.
Yes. And not only that, but the Grand Vizier, who's widely considered to be evil, is, like, is a wizard who's capable of casting 9th level spells. And not only that, but powerful wards have been built into the building that by the ancient forebears.
Oh, this led to another quandary. But what do I do if my party isn't taking the hints I give them?
Well, then you'll have to watch the episode of Arcane Mark coming this Saturday.
Yes.
That is hints and signposts about how to give effective hints and signposts.
And part of what we will talk about in hints and signposts is you dropped a hint that is as obvious as the elephant in the room, and the players still aren't getting it. What now?
That's right. Where you followed Justin Alexander's 3 clue rule, and you followed it 3 times, and you put in 9 clues, and nobody still knows any of the clues because they just aren't getting it. We will tell you what you need to do.
I'm gonna steal from the Great Worm Dragon. I'm gonna do it.
Why are you gonna steal from the Great Worm
Dragon? Because I want the shinies. I could get
Linda,
1 million
Linda,
gold.
you're level 3.
I could get 1 million gold.
You're level 3, Linda.
Yeah. That's 3. That's 3 times as powerful as level 1.
Linda, the Great Worm Dragon...
I know that's not how the math is.
The Great Worm Dragon's lair is...
That's twice as powerful
The
as
Great
level
Worm
1.
Dragon's lair is completely littered with corpses. And each of those corpses has items that are more powerful than what your character can use.
Oh, sweet. More loot for me.
You can take them.
More loot for me.
But you're really going to assault the dragon?
I'm even
They
more
were
likely
clearly
to...
at least 3 levels higher than
Thank you for telling me there's even more treasure there for me to take than I thought already. I'm even more likely to assault now.
Okay, Linda. At some point, you just have to let that happen. So, let's see. People are saying we could take them, TPKs and you.
I see recovering from a TPK, a good topic. We had an episode called TPKs and Other Calamities at one point. I'm not sure
TPKs
it's
and
on
Other
YouTube
Calamities, it's for how you handle calamities. We'll try to get that on YouTube eventually, but that's definitely a good one. Fighter attacks the planet with their sword. Look, okay, there was a barbarian in my 3.5 game who had, we joked that he had favorite enemy, the ground, even though, of course, barbarians don't have a favorite enemy. Because of the number of times he wound up attacking the ground was surprisingly high, including one time that after he'd gotten a sort of reputation for that the party's entire strategy was that they built a 100 times longer than normal length immovable rod to make sure he would be pointed in exactly the right direction, and they had him, like, you know, fire pole down this rod while using, like, triangulation of divination magic to figure out where an item they were looking for was that was being blocked by a spherical barrier that prevented divination magic. So they watched for when it went out, calculated where that was,
figured out where the center of the sphere must be.
Figured out where the center of the sphere must be, created the 100 times longer immovable rod. Then the barbarian slid down the rod and then, like, sundered down through multiple levels of a building using his momentum and then the ground until he got to where the item was.
Favorite enemy ground indeed.
That was one of multiple times that his favorite enemy was the ground. So, it's not that outrageous. It's happened before. Alright, so I think we answered everyone's GM quandaries today.
Sounds good. Shall we say goodbye to YouTube?
Let's say goodbye to YouTube. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.